This poem is divided into 3 parts, and the first part talks about chaos in creation. Last week, we were praying for our brothers and sisters outside of Manila that experienced that volcano. Did you see the news? So devastating, so scary, so fearful. And I was talking to my friend AJ, whose parents had to get evacuated from their homes. And many of us have relatives and friends that have been affected by this. And it reminds us that you turn on the news in Australia, you turn on the news in the Philippines, you turn on the news anywhere, there's always going to be reports of earthquakes, typhoons, hurricanes, volcanoes going off. And isn't it difficult to have peace when there's so much unrest in the natural world? It disrupts millions of people every day. There's always something going on, and it makes us wonder, even though we're so safe in Canada, that we have family members, we have friends that we hurt with that are affected by natural disasters. And I love that image. He says in verse 1, God is our refuge and our strength. And he says not just that, but he says, always ready in times of trouble. You see, many of us, we believe and we trust in our achievements. And we trust in the safety of our home. And we trust in the safety of our bank accounts and our investment accounts. We trust in our achievements and our resume. And yet this ancient writer says if you want to have lasting peace in a chaotic world, the first thing you've got to do is realize that God is our refuge and our strength. Not our resume, not our bank account, not the fact that we're blessed to live in Montreal or blessed to live in Canada, that we are never truly at peace in the natural world, and yet God himself promises to be our refuge and our strength. He says, he continues on, that though the oceans roar and foam. Don't you love poetry? Can you just imagine these foamy waters that are angry, this angry sea swirling around and bringing destruction and devastation? He says, despite that, God is our refuge and our strength. The second stanza talks about not what's happening in the natural world with natural disasters, but he's talking about people. People bringing chaos to this world. People fighting, nations fighting against nations, and people groups fighting against people groups, and husbands fighting against wives, and wives fighting against husbands, and all kinds of chaos in the world. Again, if you read the news, if you watch CTV, if you watch anything on Facebook, it's difficult to watch the news and not to get depressed. It's difficult to want to pay attention into what's going on in the world without letting it affect us. Isn't that true? And there's always another fight. There's always a rumor of another war. We're always in a war. And some people in some part of the world are fighting. And you might be living in an apartment building where there's constant fighting above you or across the street or even in your own apartment. There's just fighting, people fighting, people fighting. And yet in the middle of that chaos and that fighting, the writer says that in the presence of God, God's peace is there. He says the nations are in chaos and their kingdoms crumble, but God's voice thunders and the earth melts. God's army is here among us. The God of Israel is our fortress. Again, God's saying, no matter what's happening on the outside, no matter what's happening even in your own marriage, do you understand that God is here and God is in control? See, the writer is reminding us of something that we fail to appreciate, really appreciate. Because we think the nations that have the most money and the most nuclear weapons and the greatest military are in control. And actually, God's saying that I am in control. I raise up armies, I raise up kings, I raise up prime ministers, and I tear them down. God has always been in control. And the only way for us to experience peace in our marriage and peace in our homes and peace in our apartment, in our workplace, where all the fighting's going on, is for us to come and to experience the presence of God, that he is there. And for the Christ follower, what a promise. That Jesus says, I will never leave you and I will never forsake you. The great gift of Christianity is that when you give your life to Jesus, through the Spirit of God, he promises to go with us in our conflict, to go with us as we try to reconcile. He's with us on a Sunday morning just as much as he's with us on a Monday night at home. He's with us on a Monday morning as we get ready for work and we're tired and we're stressed and we've got to fight the snow and shovel before work, right? He's there. As we're worrying about our debt, worrying about our credit cards, worrying about the money that we should have not spent at Christmas time. Too late now, right? Now we've got to deal with it. And God says, give me that. No matter what's going on the outside, that you can have peace on the inside. Remember that picture of that Vancouver airport? That no matter what's going on the outside world, that if you'll just come and stay in the presence of God, if you'll be still and quiet long enough, you will experience the peace and the power of God. The last stanza concludes with a prophetic proclamation that this is not true now, but one day it will be true. And this is what he says in verse 8, "Come see the glorious work of the Lord." See how he brings destruction upon the world. He causes wars to end. Amen. Can you imagine a day where there's no news to report about fighting anymore? Can you imagine a day where people will get along? It's hard to imagine. Different skin color, different nations, different ideologies, that one day the hope for the follower of Jesus is that that will all end and Christ will ultimately rule over everything. You see, we still live in a broken world. Even though Jesus has conquered sin and conquered Satan and conquered death itself, Jesus says, in this world, you will still face trouble. But then he says at the end, take heart. Don't get discouraged because I have already overcome the world. So he continues on. I love this image again in verse 9. He causes wars to end throughout the world. He breaks the bow and he snaps the spear and he burns the shields with fire. Verse 10, be still and know that I am God. How many of you used to collect toothpicks when you were a kid? Remember you go to a restaurant, they would hand you a toothpick for whatever reason on the way out? And as a kid, you never had anything stuck in your teeth, but you just liked this idea of having a piece of wood in your mouth. Isn't that true? When I was growing up in the 80s, they had these little cinnamon sticks, cinnamon toothpicks, and you could like eat them almost and like take all the cinnamon off, and then my mouth would literally get numb because of all the cinnamon I was eating. Anyone ever had those before? Maybe that was just a me thing. Anyway, so I used to love toothpicks, and here's this great image that this author is painting. Imagine an 8-year-old taking a toothpick and how easy it is for an 8-year-old to snap a toothpick in half. That's the image that the author is giving us of the greatest fighter jets, of the nuclear warheads, of the Bradley tanks, of the drones, of all the great militaries of the world. At the right time, Jesus is going to snap them like that. And there will be no more weapons, and there will be no more militaries, and there will be no more nuclear weapons. There will be nothing left except peace, because Christ will rule. And then in verse 10, the invitation for all of us today, again, a very relevant invitation. Be still. That's the image as a parent. When you see your two siblings, your two kids fighting. I know that your kids never fight, but just in my household, they fight all the time, right? And it's, sometimes they're play fighting, but sometimes it's for reals, right? Like hair's getting pulled and punches are getting thrown. And so what do parents do after they've had enough? Stop, right? And you separate them. That's literally the image that God's saying. You've got to stop if you want to experience the peace of God. You've got to be still. You've got to stop striving, stop worrying, stop thinking about the problems, and you've got to be still long enough to invite the presence of God. We will never experience the power and the peace of God as long as our power is flowing through us. As long as it's our creativity and our ideas and the things that we're trusting in, if we're not stopping that to invite the presence of God, we will never experience true and lasting peace. Isn't that true? And so the author is saying that this is a discipline that we've got to cultivate. One of the greatest problems in our world today is anxiety, depression, and stress. This has been going on since the beginning of time, that there's been this constant war within us, worry and anxiety and pressure. And what do we do with that? Well, the author finishes by saying, be still, stop, know that I'm in control. Despite what all the news is saying, despite what you are feeling inside of you, despite even what we sometimes believe in a wrong way, God is in control today. He has always been in control. It doesn't look like it, because why would this ruler get elected? And why is this person allowed to be the ruler of this nation? And why are nuclear weapons exist? And why is technology used in such a terrible way to hurt people? Why? We wonder all that. Yet in that brokenness, we see that God is still in control. We've got to cultivate a discipline of inviting God to speak above the noise, above the chaos, and above the brokenness inside of us and outside the world. I think sometimes we forget that the Christian faith has always thrived in the chaos. I think sometimes maybe we have the expectation that all of our problems will go away and we just pray one prayer and everything will magically dissipate. And yet, we have to remember what happened on the last day of Jesus' life, that he who was perfect, he who was the Son of God, that his own friend betrayed him for 30 pieces of silver, and his other friend denied him, and his own people handed him over for death and a crucifixion that was horrible. And yet the scriptures say that when Jesus breathed his last breath, there was an earthquake. There was an earthquake that rumbled. It was angry, and it divided the city, and it shook the temple. And it reminded the world that God was in control, even at that moment. Even when everyone was celebrating the death of Jesus, God was saying, just wait. Just wait. And on the third day, what happened? Jesus rose from the darkness. My friends, the promise of Jesus coming and Jesus dying and Jesus resurrecting had been going on for hundreds of years, just as God promised, and it was fulfilled exactly to a T as God decided. What looked like the end was only the beginning. And for the follower of Jesus, you and I have the gift of understanding that God has always orchestrated all the world's events, including the events in our own lives. And he is good, and he is powerful, and as it says at the beginning, he is available to help us today. In a couple of moments, we're going to do something very different. And we're going to put some slides behind me, in front of you. And what we want to do is encourage you from Sunday to Sunday, from Monday morning or Sunday night all the way to the next Sunday morning, that you can actually hear from God if we'll be paying attention. So we're going to give you some questions to think about and images to consider. Because poetry, like the book of Psalms, helps us to understand that God is a God of emotions, and he understands our lives very, very well. And his invitation is to give all of us peace in the middle of a chaotic and noisy and a broken world. But we, you and I, have to cultivate a discipline of listening. You see, when we think about spending time with God, we're thinking about reading, we're thinking about praying and asking for stuff, and that's definitely a part of it. But I think what we've lost is the discipline of silence. Just asking God to speak above the noise, above our anxieties, above our fears, and reminding us day after day that I'm in control, that I love you, and that I'm here to help you. What would it look like if we spent every day getting that message? That despite what's happening on the outside, that God is in control, that God is your refuge and your strength, and he loves you and is ready to help you. So I just want to